What's up, guys? Um, so today I'm going to be doing something a little different. I've been meaning to do this for a while because I get a lot of people asking me for help with troubleshooting performance issues or basically problems with their rig. And I go through a process of elimination, like trying to pinpoint what the problem is. But the thing is, with PC instability and low performance, all things like that, there can be multiple causes for the same problem. So even just crashing in general can have many different causes. It can be drivers, it can be software, it can be hardware. Um, and basically, the troubleshooting steps are generally the same. Sometimes you can be lucky and you can guess the problem straight away just based on the user's system specs. Um, but yeah, generally, everyone I help, I go through the rough same troubleshooting steps and I end up eventually getting to the end of the problem. There's a few people that have more advanced issues, technical issues that either it can be faulty hardware, which is a lot harder to pinpoint, um, or it can be a specific driver issue with a specific game that also can be very hard to pinpoint, or combination of hardware that's causing the problem with that specific game. So what I wanted to do is this troubleshooting guide that I can just link people instead of having to, for example, I might get a request for help and I read the message uh, 14 hours later, and then I reply to them and ask them a question, and depending on when they're online, it takes them another day or something to reply. And rather than that, I can just link them this guide. So I can link you guys this guide, and it is going to be a long video, but it's going to help. Like, you can basically skim through it. You can set the speed on the video playback to a faster setting. Um, have it play back a bit faster if you don't have time, or you can skip through. I'll try to put timestamps in the comments so that you can just skip to whatever section is relevant to you. But generally, if you're not really tech savvy, like if you haven't been building and overclocking for over 10 years, and you're still learning things, then you might want to sit through the whole thing just so in case you've missed something. But I will also have a text guide so that if you don't want to sit through me talking through the entire video, you can literally just read through the text guide, and I will elaborate on all the points in the guide. But yeah, you can also like try to see, oh, you want to learn more about that, just click on that, because I'll try to timestamp everything um, later on after I've got the video uploaded. So this is the tech guide here, and you can see there is a lot of steps that goes with troubleshooting, and a lot of it has to do with basic things that if I was building a PC for the first time, I would already make sure all of these are in check as I build it, and as I install the OS and install the drivers, I would actually check all of this on a first time build. Some of these steps you don't have to worry about with a store built PC if it's from a reputable store that does their stability testing already. Like pre-overclock systems, they usually do some thorough stability testing, and if there's any stability issues, you can literally warranty at the store that they've got to get it stable and without any payment or anything. But if you bought from a cheaper store that maybe their tech support or their hardware crew may have overlooked certain things, you might want to go through all these to actually make sure your PC was configured correctly to begin with. Because some people having issues, they'll say it's brand new, but it's got like a hardware issue that it literally came with. Like, for example, even laptops, which are supposed to be integrated, everything in a laptop is meant to be set up out of the box. And there are laptops that come with one 16 gig stick of RAM, single channel, which completely gimps the bandwidth. And they'll even have an i7 or a high-end Ryzen CPU, multi-core CPU that needs a lot of bandwidth, and it'll still have a single channel stick of RAM and a decent, mobile GPU. And then they'll say, oh, well, other videos online from, different manufacturers that include the proper RAM setup, other videos online are showing much better performance. Or someone will have a desktop spec that was from Best Buy or something, and it's come with either an something's inadequate in the system, and it's just been to cut corners, because they cut corners on power supplies, they cut corners on RAM configuration, most especially they cut corners on motherboards with specific combinations of hardware. So you basically just want to be aware of what's in your system if it's a pre-built. But if you're also a custom builder for your first time, there is some misinformation going around with what is important for a gaming PC, what's important for performance, particularly in the RAM area, because there's a myth that single versus dual channel doesn't matter, and there's a myth that RAM speed doesn't affect gaming, which maybe it was true in 2013 when computer hardware was not powerful enough to push high frame rates. We weren't all trying to push like over 100 FPS in most titles. People weren't playing at 300 FPS all the time. But these days, when you're running competitive settings in an esports title, if you don't have enough memory bandwidth, the symptoms will be low GPU usage. Your FPS will be like half of what you're seeing other people getting on benchmarks online, and it's just classic uh, memory bandwidth bottleneck. So I'll go through all that. So anyway, to get started, we'll just go from the top here. So you can skip to whatever's relevant, but first thing you want to make sure with your hardware is that everything's configured properly. So your CPU, if it's mounted properly, the temps should be under 80C under load. So you can already notice an issue here if you boot up your PC and press delete. Just pretend you haven't got the OS installed yet. You'll notice really high temps in the BIOS if there's something wrong with the cooler mounting. It'll be like 60 degrees, and the BIOS is under load, but I would call it a medium-ish load because it can show a higher than Windows desktop load. Or sometimes it's like 10 degrees higher than Windows, but really if there's an issue with the cooler mounting, you'll see high BIOS temps, and that's already a sign. Like, don't even bother going into installing Windows and doing all that. If your temps are really high in the BIOS, check your cooler mounting, check that the sticker that's, if you installed if it's an aftermarket cooler, they have like a little film that you got to peel off. Check your thermal paste, check the mounting pressure, that it's not like loose or not even on one side. And yeah, just double check all that. And you should be seeing ideally 50 or under load. Like, you might see 55 in a really hot climate. If you've got a hot room, then that's expected, especially on a stock cooler, because some motherboards will apply a higher automatic voltage, which can result in high idle temps. So it's not always the cooler, but you should still check it. But if you're running a really, really small budget cooler, then you might expect high temps, so that's a given. Then secondly, your 2 sticks of RAM, because you want dual channel. One stick is like a one-lane highway, so your CPU and your GPU have to communicate. 1 stick of RAM, it's like data can only go through that 1 stick to the GPU. 2 sticks of RAM doubles the speed, so it's like 2-lane highway. So the CPU and GPU can communicate without any delays. So you think of it as if 2 sticks are 30,000 Mbps of bandwidth, 1 stick is around 15,000. And that will cause performance bottlenecks even on mid-range hardware. So you're running like a Ryzen 2600 and a RX 580 or a GTX 1060. That's like middle to lower end. That will still have an issue with single channel when you're running esports titles, because esports are the big titles, right? The most people are playing. If you look at Steam charts, it's games like CS:GO, Dota 2, Overwatch. They're all technically more CPU heavy because you run settings that want to push high frame rates. And when you're pushing like over 150 FPS, that's more data that the CPU sends all the instructions for all the information that the GPU has to process and turn into frames. So that's more data. If you think of like 150 frames worth of data going between the CPU and GPU compared to 60 frames on a AAA title at 4K, or just a AAA graphically intensive title like Tomb Raider. That's going to have less CPU load than Overwatch on competitive settings where you want to get stable 300 FPS. So pushing higher frame rates equals more data, means more bandwidth requirement. And not all websites test this properly. They test ultra settings at 1080p, which places more load on the GPU and naturally runs lower FPS. They're not testing at 150 FPS or 300 FPS like you would for Dota 2. So that it's like a overlooked part of some benchmarks, because a lot of people don't always plan to play AAA titles. That's kind of like that takes a back seat to their daily titles, that after playing your AAA single player title, a lot of people go back to playing an esports title that is their daily driver, like Dota 2 or Overwatch or CS:GO or Rainbow Six Siege. They're the really big titles that people are playing. Even Escape from Tarkov, people try to adjust settings to get maximum FPS. So and as well, sometimes there can be an increase in memory bandwidth requirements if the game is really memory heavy. So if the game uses a ton more VRAM and it's pushing 100 FPS, it could be using just as much, if not more, bandwidth between the CPU and GPU than a game that's running on low settings pushing 300 FPS. So there can still be situations where your overall bandwidth is still important for pushing a lot of data if it's swapping between the RAM and the GPU, etc. So 2 sticks in dual channel is literally a must. I wouldn't recommend anyone run single channel. Um, it's just a budget configuration that used to be okay, but nowadays it's like the only time you could really suggest it is if you really wanted to get your build complete and you could only afford a single stick, but you know that you can purchase another identical stick for an extra 25, $50 within a month of your build. And so then you'll already be aware that your performance is going to be low until you upgrade. But if you're playing GPU intensive titles or doing GPU intensive benchmarks, you probably won't notice a difference running single channel versus dual, because it's all the load is on the GPU, the frames are lower, and you might see a slightly different, like a bit of loss in score, but generally the GPU intensive titles don't use that much CPU. So if the CPU is not doing much work, the GPU is processing everything, all the CPU has to do is keep up with what the GPU is giving it. Oh, sorry, I had my screen go in standby. And then the next is GPU in your top slot. So some people actually end up putting the GPU in another slot. Maybe they feel like they don't have clearance, or for some reason they put it in the second slot, not realizing that the second slot that it'll fit in, the lower slot on most motherboards, does not run at full bandwidth. It runs at ×8 or ×4. So you want your GPU ideally in the top slot. I don't know what could be getting in the way, but try to fix it or account for that when you're selecting your motherboard and your PC case and your cooling system. Try to account for clearance to get your GPU in the slot in the top one. And then any 2020 system should be running an SSD for the OS. And this is like, I've been running SSDs since they first released. I was an early adopter, but the biggest difference to performance over the past 15 years, I would say, has been SSDs. That's the biggest jump in performance in terms of system responsiveness, not necessarily game FPS performance, but when you get a new system and you navigate, every single user on the planet navigates through your UI and your OS and your and loads files, loads videos, loads pictures. All of that is sped up by an SSD, not by having a faster CPU. You could have a 100-core CPU, and it's not going to outperform a 4-core CPU with an SSD if the 100-core CPU has to load data off a hard drive, because a hard drive is the bottleneck. Just look it up. Look up hard drive latency, seek times, and then look up SSD latency, and you will see a massive difference. Like, there's a huge latency difference there. So when you're thinking of a 2020 build, everyone should run an SSD for the OS. I know there's budget constraints where you have to choose between, maybe you have a lot of media that you really need to store. So you have like terabytes of thousands of gigabytes of media, and you can't afford an SSD because you need a 2 terabyte hard drive. So you just went with a single hard drive setup. Your system responsiveness is going to be bottlenecked by that hard drive. Okay, so ideally you want an SSD. If you have a hard drive, bad luck, but at least you know that that's what's limiting your desktop performance. When you browse, when you open files on an SSD, this is what it's like. In case anyone's still running a hard drive in 2020 as their main OS, when you open files, that's what it's like. The little loading symbol is that fast. And it's the same for videos. If you open a video and you skip, it'll be instant on an SSD. With a hard drive, you can get that seek, the little blue loading symbol that appears. See, it just pops up for a second when I open these pictures. And that's the main issue. You do get faster game load times. It won't improve your FPS, but it can help with stutter as well, especially loading stutter. Some games do still load and use page file, and if your page file is on an SSD, it's going to be faster than a hard drive. So get that out of the way. That's just for system responsiveness. And then you also want to make sure your PSU meets the recommended spec for your GPU. This is particularly important with mid to high end graphics cards. If it says minimum 600 watts, and then you've got a decent CPU paired with your GPU, and then you go for like a budget 600 watt power supply that maybe it's just 80 plus, it's not even bronze rated, the gauge of the cables, the quality of the cables is going to be lower than with a platinum rated power supply or a slightly higher wattage power supply. And there can be issues. With NVIDIA, it particularly happens with their higher end cards with the 2080 Ti. You can literally look it up. There's people that have power supply issues with 2080 Ti's, black screens, similar to what AMD are having with their mid-range Navi GPUs. Okay, mid to high range, I should say. With AMD graphics cards, the issue seems to be more related to running the minimum. Like the minimum is 600 watts for RX 5700 and XT, and then the recommended is actually 700 watts. And there's people running like budget 600, 650, and they'll have one cable with two splitters on the end, like a 8-pin and a 6-pin, and they'll be running the GPU off this one cable, and depending on the gauge of that cable, it can affect stability under load, because the cable is not actually rated to handle enough current, enough power coming through. So one fix has been people recommend to use a separate cable, because even a 650 watt power supply should come with two cables, two PCI power cables, separate ones. Even if there's two connectors on the end of each one, you're just using one connector from each cable. So you've got a separate line going down for each connector on the GPU to the power supply, and that can avoid a lot of issues. But worst case scenario, upgrade to a higher quality PSU, or just don't skimp on your PSU if you're planning to use, like, literally just Google the power supply recommendation. There are plenty of people will say, well, you can just run a 500 watt PSU because under load it's only going to use 300 watts, but that's not accounting for possible voltage spikes and certain situations where the load will jump a little bit higher, and with the wrong power supply, that can result in a crash. It can result in a blue screen. Sometimes it is just driver related. They haven't optimized their drivers properly to manage for the power management of the GPU, and it's just drawing too much power than what it's rated to do. But generally, when I've looked up troubleshooting forums, I've seen people on high-end NVIDIA and Navi with AMD that have literally just got crappy power supplies. So go for a quality power supply, you won't have issues. I've never had a power supply issue because I always run, like, I don't skimp on that area. So my previous build with the 1070 Ti was running a 660 watt platinum, and my current build is on a 1000 watt platinum, which is definitely overkill, but it gives me headroom in the future. I'm not going to have to buy a new power supply for a long time, if ever. So, just be aware of that. And then we'll move on to the BIOS. So with the BIOS, you want to make sure it's updated with any critical updates. You can't necessarily check this when you haven't installed Windows yet unless you have access to the internet on a separate PC, which if you do, then look it up, because you can check your BIOS version before installing Windows just by going into the BIOS, spamming delete. You'll be able to bring up your BIOS information. So you need to learn to navigate your BIOS. That's important for any PC owner. And for SSDs, your storage mode should be set to AHCI, which used to be a thing on older chipsets, because there was an IDE mode that it would default to, and you have to set AHCI, which is like advanced host controller. Like it basically lets the SSD use its advanced functionalities for garbage cleaning and running in an optimal condition. And if it's not an AHCI, you can get basically performance issues with SSDs. That happen a lot quicker. So, for example, if you fill the SSD up and then you delete a bunch of files, the time it takes for the SSD's read and write speed to stabilize will depend on it being an AHCI and the garbage collection working properly. So, ideally, AHCI, it's default on newer boards. And what else about SSDs? Like, they have trim command that should automatically, if you know about defragmentation, with Windows 10 they've fixed it. So if you have an SSD installed and you open it, it does do the trim by itself. So see, I've got all SSDs, optimize all, it's trimming. It's doing, but that's usually set in a schedule, and you don't have to worry about manually setting trim commands or anything like that in Windows 10. At least version 1903, it handles it for you. And on board, if you're using an M2 drive, because M2 are getting popular now, those are the drives that are like the little sticks that you slide into the motherboard, like directly. There's no SATA cable. Sometimes the M2 drive won't appear when you try to install on it, if you're just a fresh builder looking for help. And there's actually a setting within onboard devices configurations, you can see here, for M2 drives. On ASUS, it's actually called PCI bandwidth. You have to enable M2 bandwidth to get your M2 drives to work properly. But that's more of a OS installation. It's not really critical. If you're already having issues at the desktop level, you've probably got past all this already, but you can still check for critical BIOS updates. Anything that mentions memory compatibility, stability, stuff like that, you might want to update your BIOS. But generally, if your system's running fine already and you're just having a minor issue like low FPS, don't update the BIOS if it's not related to your issue. So with your RAM, like where's my RAM? I'm almost up to that section. I can skip to it. Um, with your RAM specifically, when you first build your system or get a new system, um, RAM speeds above 2400 megahertz are technically overclocked, or they're pre-overclocked kits. So a 3000 kit of RAM, whether it be for AMD or Intel, is factory overclocked. Basically, it's been tested at that speed to be stable, but that does not mean it's going to be stable with all CPUs and all configurations, because there's other factors that affect the stability of 3000 megahertz RAM, namely the memory controller on the CPU itself, which is different between every single CPU. So you can have three 9900Ks, and one can have a really strong memory controller, one can have an average one, and one could just have a really slack memory controller in comparison. So that usually won't affect 3000 megahertz, but it starts to matter more above 3000. Like when you get into 3600 range, you might buy a really flashy 3600 megahertz kit of RAM, and the memory controller on your CPU just might not be able to cut it, and you'll have instability issues. So that's where, if you are running RAM like that, you set the extreme memory profile, or the pre-overclocked factory profile in the BIOS under the RAM configuration, or it'll be under overclocking. There's like an OC tweaking section of your BIOS. Enable XMP for Intel, or I think it's DOCP for AMD. And if you want, you can try to install Windows and just boot up, but generally I would recommend most people try to get memtest 86 on a USB stick and do your RAM stability testing straight away, because even perfectly functioning RAM can still throw up errors if there's an issue with the CPU stability based on its memory controller. And it's not a hardware problem. The CPU is not defective. Nothing is defective. It's just the motherboard and that XMP profile, the timings it's setting. There's an incompatibility there, but nothing's actually broken. It's just the timings might, on that particular BIOS version even, because there's plenty of BIOS updates that you might notice that mention memory compatibility. And that is them trying to tweak the XMP profiles to all be stable, and improve the subtimings and everything. So without getting too deep into RAM configuration, it's just a good rule of thumb to do waste, even if it is like tedious. Get memtest 86 on a USB, boot off that USB as you would for doing a Windows install, and memtest your RAM. So stress test your RAM. So it'll find, if errors come up immediately, then yes, you might just have a bad stick of RAM. Or if you're running, like for example, you're running a 3600 megahertz RAM profile, and you've managed to boot into the BIOS, you managed to get into memtest 86. If it throws up errors immediately, it does not mean the RAM is defective. Some people will say this. This is actually a myth. Errors in memtest 86 does not always mean the RAM is defective if you're running at an overclocked profile. Okay. To make 100% sure the RAM is defective, you want to go back into your BIOS, set the RAM to default speed, 2133 or 2400, to make sure the CPU is not affecting the RAM stability. Okay, and then go back into memtest 86 and test again. And if it's stable at stock, it means that it was the overclock profile that's got an issue. Sometimes that can be because the RAM is actually defective; it can't run at that rated speed. But sometimes it's just that the CPU memory controller was not strong enough to run that speed. So it's actually a fine line. You have to find out what the actual problem is. And a lot of people that can't run at 3200 do naturally figure out that, okay, maybe my memory controller is just not able to run at these voltages. And then they try to manually tune those same settings. They'll just enter it manually into the BIOS, and that'll get the RAM working. Or if that doesn't work, they might just try dropping the speed one notch. So instead of 3600, they'll try 3400 or 3466 or 3200. And then instead of shooting for max speed, they might tighten the timings up. That gets a bit technical. There are guides on it online. But the general gist of it is, don't always write the memory off because you got errors. You've got to run a stock test and then try to tune it and see if you can get it stable. If it's stable, then you go back to memtest 86. You might be able to pass for hours with no issues, and there's nothing wrong with the RAM. Like for me, if I put it to 3200 megahertz, my 6700K can't handle it at what I call reasonable voltages. There's extra voltage settings that come into play, but at the voltages I'm comfortable with, mine can't run 3200, but it can run 3000 with much tighter timings. Well, not much tighter, but better timings than the RAM's rated for at 3200. So I ended up settling for that instead of RMAing the kit, sending it back saying your kit's defective and stuff like that. Like I did try to email G.Skill, but it turns into like you can point fingers at the CPU, and it's kind of hard to prove that it's definitely the RAM at that point, unless the RAM just errors no matter what you do. So you can't even run it at stock without errors. Then that's like a surefire way. If you can prove that at stock, like standard speeds, which is what the RAM defaults to, if you don't set the profile in the BIOS, RAM will default to the CPU rated speeds. So most current gen CPUs are rated for DDR4 2133 or 2400. That's what they'll default to if you don't set your RAM speed. And if the RAM can't pass memtest 86 at those speeds, then there you go. You'll know that there's a problem with the RAM for sure. So as well, if you don't have memtest 86, but you already got your Windows installed, there's also a built-in memtest. You can actually just I've got another one installed. Sorry. Memory diagnostic, Windows memory diagnostic that you can run as a schedule, and it'll boot from the BIOS level and run this before logging into Windows. And this can also be reliable, but also keep in mind that even when you've used multiple stability testing programs to check that your RAM's stable, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is 1,000,000% stable in everything you could possibly use. There are some applications that will just trigger a RAM instability, and you might have to just change the voltage or a setting just one notch, and then you'll be stable in that program. But that gets into the more long-term troubleshooting, so it's a bit tedious to go into now. So we've got that out of the way. In the BIOS, there's a section for fan profile for your CPU cooler, and smart fan control. If you're running an all-in-one cooler, you have to check if it's okay on PWM control, which is automatic control, or sometimes they'll just recommend you run the pump full speed, the AIO cooler pump. So you have to figure out what your brand, like your Corsair or your NZXT cooler, you have to figure out what they recommend in their instructions, because they'll tell you in the CPU cooler instructions how to set your pump profile. Or on newer motherboards, they actually have a pump header, and it's already automatically configured once you plug that in. But that's important, because as well as the pump speed, just for your CPU fan in general or your radiator fans, they'll run on a rather relaxed default profile if you do not set a manual profile for those fans. So you want to go into your smart fan control or your system monitoring section. It depends on the motherboard. They have different names, and you want to adjust a fan curve that ramps up under load as quick as possible. Because if you let it all heat up and then the fan speed adjusts to catch up to the temperature, you'll find that it's harder to bring a temp down once it's already heated, compared to keeping the temp lower in the first place by running a higher fan speed or having your fan speed ramp up quickly. So you might want a more aggressive profile where you're already at 50% at 45 degrees, which is like average load to low load. And then under gaming load, which is like 50 to 60 degrees, you already want to be up at 70% fan speed. And if you set an aggressive profile like that, your temps will be much better. It'll make a bit more noise, but it's like a trade-off. You have to decide. Would you rather have more noise, better temps, better stability, better boost clocks, more stable boost clocks, or would you rather run borderline temps and have less noise, basically? And don't worry about the fans failing, because I just think of it in relation to your whole system's performance. You want your PC performing good at the risk of a fan failing like 1 year early, which is like really cheap to replace, or do you want to have possible temperature issues over the different temperature range that might be in your climate, in your area? Like some places can hit 40-degree, and it's even hotter indoors, 40-degree temps that at certain times of the year they've got to worry about their PC overheating, which if you run a good fan profile, you don't have to worry about that for the most part. So just be aware of that. I'm not saying everyone has to do this. If you're happy with how your temperatures are, don't worry about this. It's just something to be aware of. So you want reasonable temps, and you can also check your vCore, which is your CPU voltage, isn't too high on automatic. This is a common issue of overheating, especially with stock coolers. If you're running like a Ryzen 3600, generally the BIOS, the motherboard, will run a voltage that's compatible with all 3600s. So that accounts for quality between a lower quality 3600 chip and a higher quality one, because they have a thing called binning, where as long as it can run at a certain voltage, it will pass, that CPU will pass and be sellable at retail. So if there's a certain voltage the CPU won't run at, then they might discard that or knock it down to it. They'll disable some cores and sell it as a cheaper model. So you just need to be aware of that. So there's a certain range where you can have where they tend to be on the higher end to account for all CPUs, that like the CPUs that just need a little bit more voltage to get stable. But you might actually have a CPU down here that can run at this voltage, that can run 0.05 volts lower and still be stable. And that can be a big temp difference. It can be like 5 to 10 degrees or more. So be aware of that. And the way that you would diagnose that is you'll have to learn how to stress test, which can be done by desktop use, but you're kind of risking corruption if you just do, if it's a really bad instability. But generally, you can go online and just Google your CPU model and average vCore, and you can find like, and generally, like if you find the average vCore is like 1.35 volts, you might find that your BIOS is putting in 1.4 volts, and you can try going down to 1.35. And what'll happen is either it'll be able to boot Windows and it'll be stable, or it'll get halfway through booting and crash. Okay, so it'll like reset, and you have to go. Hopefully, you've saved your BIOS profile after you've configured everything. Because there's a setting in BIOS, you can actually save profile for all the settings that you've set. So make sure you save your BIOS profile before you get into this that I'm discussing here. So after you save your BIOS profile, you can actually just try adjusting the voltage lower. And this is like a shortcut method, but you might find the average. So I can just show you in Google here. You can find what people are saying. Because see, people saying high idle voltage, that's from automatic motherboard control. Like this person's got 1.4 volts stock. And there's ways to, there's other things like limiting the temperature. But anyway, some people are saying 1.2 to 1.25. Try to look for some consistency. People are arguing here. Someone said 1.3 volts. Final word on idle voltages. This was something posted from probably, let's see here. But this is applicable to all CPUs, okay? So 1.4 volts is fine, but it seems you can get lower voltage. It just depends. But the general idea of it is what I'm telling you is that the automatic BIOS voltages are set for compatibility. They're not fine-tuned for all CPUs because it's not like it doesn't automatically tune. There is a thing called VID. Like there's a voltage set in the CPU itself that can help to regulate the automatic voltage, but that doesn't mean you can't get the temps lower just by bumping it down a bit. So yeah, if your motherboard's putting in 1.4, the quick method, you might try 1.35. If it doesn't boot, reload your profile, and then try 1.36, and get to a point where you can boot to Windows. Then if you're at Windows and it crashes again, try 1.37. And that's a way. It depends how long the crash is, though. Like you'll notice that as you get more stable, it takes longer to crash, and you can do more things before the system crashes. Now, the quick way to induce a crash is to just run a benchmark like ASUS RealBench, like this. RealBench. So that's a benchmark right there that tests a range of things. Now, if you're really unstable, that'll crash your system straight away. If you're on the verge of stability, you might get halfway through the bench, and instead of a crash, it'll just come up with an error, like a mismatch. And it'll come up in red in the window for it. So if you get that error, it might just be a tiny voltage bump. Instead of jumping it up from 1.37 to 1.38, you might be able to go 1.372. Okay? So that's how you kind of can undervolt your CPU and gain a lot of, and it's not really undervolting though, it's just setting it into a lower range of that it's still stable at, but you're still within the actual average range of that CPU. So you're not necessarily undervolting, you're just stopping the motherboard applying the maximum voltage that they do for compatibility. So that's something to be aware of. And if you're on a newer AMD GPU that are running PCI 4, which is for the X570 motherboards, there is a possibility that something on the GPU level is making a PCI 4 call on older generation boards because I was having weird desync issues, and I noticed less issues, or basically they were all gone after forcing PCI mode to 3 instead of auto in my BIOS for my Z170 board. So just be aware of that. It's something you can try. It's not going to hurt anything, and even on a PCI 4 board, PCI 3 is perfectly fine. It's just plenty of bandwidth for an RX 5700 or an RX 5700 XT. But it's just something to try if you're having issues. If you're not having issues, don't worry about it. Okay, so after all that, we're out of the BIOS and hardware level stuff. We're going to go into OS and drivers. So ideally, you've got your Windows 10 version downloaded from Microsoft, and hopefully a recent build, because there is a driver compatibility issue with older builds and newer builds. So if you're on version 1700 of Windows, there's actually specific drivers for 1700, even audio drivers and LAN drivers that are not compatible with 1900. You need the newer 1900 version of drivers for your internet or for your audio. So this causes issues for some people because it runs on the generic drivers if you don't install them yourself, or sometimes it doesn't install the right drivers at all and you find your sound's not working properly. So just be aware of that. And the way to get a legit copy of Windows that you know is not infected with malware or Trojans or whatever is just type in Windows 10 ISO. And that'll get you a direct download, disk image download direct from Microsoft. And there's a little tool you can get called Media Creator Tool that will let you create an installable Windows 10 USB stick. So you just need an 8GB USB. You download the tool, and it'll load the Windows 10 onto that USB, and then you can literally install Windows from a USB stick. You don't need a disk. It's I think it's been the norm for a while now. Like I've been doing that for years now. So that's how you get your installation media, and then you can still use your normal Windows 10 key from your old disk or that you've bought online. There's digital copies of Windows 10 you can buy, and punch that in once you've got the Windows installed. So, and then once you've booted into Windows, do your Windows updates to make sure you aren't on an old build. But if you want to know how to check, just go to Start and type WinVer, like that, and you can see your Windows 10 build. So I'm on 1903. If you're on 1700 or something older, it's a good idea to update because the 1900 drivers are not there's a driver level incompatibility between the older Windows versions and the latest ones. Okay, so after getting that out of the way, just show you here. So after you've got your Windows version, you know that your Windows is fairly recent. You've got it up to date. This is probably what I would look at first, depending on whether your Ethernet's working or what you're using to download your drivers. Sometimes you can't get your PC plugged in straight away, or your Ethernet might not even work without the correct drivers if you don't have your disk, your motherboard disk. So depending on that, if you've got to use external downloads, this is how you do it. First, you would install CPU-Z, and this is also accounting for people that don't know their motherboard model. Maybe they're not very tech savvy. It could be their first build. They've already installed everything and realized they don't know their exact motherboard model, and they don't have the box for some reason. Or they've got a store-built PC that didn't include proper information, and they're trying to make sure everything's set up right. So for you guys trying to do that, this is how you check all the information on your PC. There are ways to do it directly through Windows through DirectX Diagnostics, but I would rather just recommend you install this app, because it's really handy. CPU-Z. So just put CPU-Z into Google and set up English or the zip file if you're familiar with how zip files work for a portable folder that you can just have the folder there and delete it whenever you don't want it, and then run that program, and you can find out about your PC. The important details, except for your GPU. It doesn't show you GPU details, I don't think. Oh no, they do have graphics there, so it will tell me my GPU model. It's just not fine details. So CPU model, the cache of your CPU, that's not that important. Your main board. So this is your motherboard. You've got your manufacturer and your model. Those are the important ones, and then you've also got your BIOS version for when you go to your motherboard support page if you want to see if there's any important BIOS updates. So this is an important tab, and this is an important tab, which is your memory tab that tells you what your memory speed is running at. But for the sake of this text guide, we'll start with the mainboard tab. So this is how you ensure you've got the right drivers installed rather than letting Windows 10 automatically have whatever its default drivers are. Your chipset drivers are the most important because they control communication for your motherboard and all the components. So yeah, your GPU, your RAM, your CPU cannot communicate effectively if they're on uh, basically a standard chipset driver rather than the specific chipset driver. So if they, or they could just be missing and you're just running on bare bones drivers, which are not meant for optimal performance. So if you've got low GPU usage, the chipset drivers missing can be one of the main causes of that, or just low FPS in general. You want to make sure these are installed. So just as an example, my manufacturer and my CPU model, that's what you search in Google. So MSI Z170A Gaming Pro. And then just, if you want to go straight to the right section, type support. And it'll be the top result. And you can see here BIOS version. So the way I would see if I need a BIOS update, let's just pretend I'm on 1.9. As I go up in version, I look for stuff that's got compatibility or anything relevant to performance that sounds good. Like, so PCI compatibility, enhanced, well, that's not really important. Microcode updates, which can be security related and actually hurt performance, but compatibility if you're running NVMe drives, PCI is GPU compatibility, next gen CPU support, well, that's self-explanatory, but you can see here, M2 Genie function, no. Memory compatibility problem. So if you've got issues getting your RAM stable, this BIOS update might help. Or if you're just really far behind, then just make sure that there's no fine print that says you need to update in steps. Some BIOSes will, if you're on a really old version, you can't just jump to the latest BIOS. You have to make sure that there's not a like in red text, they'll literally tell you you need to go to this version first before you update to this one. So just make sure you read carefully. Don't just install the latest BIOS. You can end up almost bricking your motherboard if you just jump to, if you do too big of a jump between BIOS versions. But at least on this motherboard, it seems fine. But you can see there's actually a lot. If I was down at one of these lower revisions, there is a ton of memory compatibility issues they were trying to fix. But I'm on 1.F, which is this one here. And 1G does not show any memory improvement. So this is the best I can expect, and they haven't updated it since 2018. But just example, because a lot of users are going to be running B450, we can just look up Morta Max. This is a bit more relevant to the newer builds of 2020. And under your support section, you can see the BIOS updates here. Even just this one, if you're running a newer GPU or system boot up time is a nice improvement to have. So you might want to update to this one if you're on an older one. But there's also memory compatibility in there. So generally you want to check the BIOS. If you're on a newer chipset, you want to check for BIOS updates every month or every other week, because sometimes they can be critical. But if you're on and right, my son's here. What's up? Okay. Oh, okay. I'll fix it after. Go wait out there. I'll fix it soon, buddy. He's playing Scrap Mechanic. So yeah, basically you just want to get anything critical. But if you're already stable and everything's running fine and your XMP, your memory profile's working fine and you've got no issues, then don't update your BIOS. Even if there's an update that says memory compatibility, if you've got it running good and you're benchmarked and you're playing performance is perfect, don't update unnecessarily. It's just more of an early build thing. When you've got a brand new build or you've got a brand new store-bought PC, that's when the BIOS updates might be more important, especially if you're running on a really old BIOS. But if you're running on like, maybe you're running down here, system boot up time, that might be the only benefit. But if you're happy with your system boot up time, if that improves it by a second, maybe it's not worth it, because you have to have your BIOS profile saved in the first place, or remember your settings, because sometimes it'll reset them all. You have to re-enter it all. And sometimes it's just not worth the hassle of updating BIOS. Or if you have unstable power and you don't have a backup power, it can be a bit risky. Like if you just happen to have the worst luck and you're updating your BIOS and then the power cuts out in your area, your board can literally be broken, be bricked from that, and it can be hard to recover. Thankfully, a lot of boards do have backup power, backup BIOS, so you can set it up again. But yeah, it's it's a personal preference depending on what you want to do. Sorry, my son's like having a tantrum out there because he scrap mechanic his friend left him, and it turned off the game. So anyway, BIOS out of the way, chipset driver out of the way. We haven't got that out of the way, sorry. So your chipset drivers are pretty self-explanatory, but the importance of them is your motherboard communication. So you can see here there's only one chipset driver it's listed. You can get them directly from AMD and Intel, but generally, at least for Intel, I try to just stick with the motherboard support page drivers, and it doesn't hurt. Like if there's anything really critical, like MSI for your B450M, they'll probably post it here. If this, see how this is already this was at the end of 2019. If there's anything else critical in there, they'll probably post it, and you don't have to worry about going directly to AMD. But you can cross-reference, like it doesn't hurt. If you're having issues and you think it might be driver related, you can search AMD chipset driver and just go to driver and support, and you'd go to chipsets. AM4 is the desktop platform, B450. And you can see here, they've even got support for Windows 7, but I still recommend Windows 10 just for compatibility's sake. And you can see here they've got 2.03, and this was 19/3/2020. And just check the driver details, see if there's, as long as it's supported, yeah, it's fine. So doesn't seem to be change notes there, so I wouldn't necessarily upgrade if you don't feel you need to. But if you're having an issue, sometimes it can help to upgrade directly from AMD. And same with Intel, though I've found with Intel, like at least with the Z170 motherboard chipset drivers, I was stable through all of them. Like I didn't even need to update them, I don't think, for any reason, but I just kept them up to date for the sake of it. But I didn't have any compatibility issues with Intel. But AMD's got, they're running newer combinations of hardware, and their motherboards carry over like between different CPU generations, unlike Intel that force you to upgrade your chipset between like 6th gen and 7th gen to 8th gen. You can go 3 generations on AM4. So obviously the chipset drivers might be a bit more critical because they include communication for your CPU as well. So you got to factor that in. And then you've got your audio and your LAN drivers, so audio, sound, and internet, your Ethernet cable. So as you can see here on the audio ones in particular, they say installing for Windows 10 RS3 Redstone 3. So that's like the more recent builds of Windows, and then RS2 is the older builds, so like version 1700. But you can Google it to make sure. But this is what I was saying about making sure your Windows is up to date. If you're running an older Windows and you accidentally put on the newer drivers, or Windows Update tries to install new drivers without having the Windows version up to date, you can run into issues with your sound and all sorts of things. So, and even the Microsoft game titles, Microsoft Store, that's more on Windows 10. I don't even think you can install Microsoft Store games on Windows 7. So be aware of that. And then GPU drivers are directly from AMD and NVIDIA. Like you don't necessarily go to your manufacturer, and unlike with the motherboards, you don't go to your MSI web page other than for the MSI software. So if you want MSI Afterburner for GPU control, but for your drivers, you generally go to your relevant relevant brand. So NVIDIA or AMD for graphics drivers. So you can see here NVIDIA, and you'd put in GeForce 20 series, and there's Studio Driver, which is for creators. These are for stability. And then there's Game Ready Driver, which is for the most up-to-date game performance enhancements. So if they've optimized the drivers for the latest game, you're going to get better performance with the Game Ready than with the Studio. But the Studio are for stability with you might be doing a lot of streaming and content creation that's using the encoder on the GPU. And the Studio Driver is basically made for the best stability possible on that. It's basically the version that's got the best stability. But you can still do it on the Game Ready. It's just if you do run into an issue, it's more likely to happen on the Game Ready drivers. And with AMD, it's self-explanatory as well. You just go through the same section for your GPUs, and RX 5700 or Radeon 580, whatever RX 500 series, and just punch it in. and get your latest driver. So Adrenalin 20.4.1. Okay, so from there we'll go into your stability monitoring, and this is the diagnostic side where you might already have got all of the other stuff I went through. You might have double checked this by now and you think it's all good. Then we get into the actual max temp monitoring, which is a bit different to if you've just been checking the BIOS temp, or you've just got a simple temp monitoring tool that you might, like for example, a lot of people will do this. They'll install something like Hardware Monitor, or they'll go to Task Manager, Performance, and wait, I don't even think Task Manager has it. No, you can't monitor temps there. Resource Monitor? I'm pretty sure there was a monitor. Oh, I don't know where it is. But they'll use a monitoring tool like it used to be Core Temp, but I know that people are getting a bit clued up now using Hardware Info and Hardware Monitor. But just don't make this mistake of having your CPU temp in an application. Like here, do I have it in Afterburner? They'll have their CPU temp, but they won't look at the history when they're checking game load temperature. So this, not everyone does this. It is an easy mistake to make for beginners though. Basically, see here, I've got my CPU temperature. Afterburner is actually good because it says your max, but does it say it down here? Oh no, it does say it in here. So it's more to do with like monitoring like that, or hardware monitor. If you're not looking at it properly, you need to make sure you look at your max column. So with your max column, that'll tell you what the maximum temperature it reached while you were playing. But if you were looking just at value, if you just happen to look at it wrong, and you think your temps are fine, or if you have core temp installed down in the tray, or even hardware info, I think can run in the tray for your temp. When you alt tab out, the second that you alt tab, the temp can drop in that second that it takes to alt tab to the desktop. Your temp can go from 60 to 40. So you might think your temps are perfectly fine, or they can go from like 90 down to 60. When actually it's been getting hot. Like, see, my peak temp here is 57, but if I just glance at the desktop, it's 37 or 31. So just be aware of that. The peak temperatures and good monitoring applications are Hardware Monitor, Core Temp, and for AMD Hardware Info. But if you're just specifically looking at your CPU, I would actually use separate programs. I would use something like MSI Afterburner for the GPU side, although it can do CPU as well. And I would use Core Temp for the CPU. So I would use MSI Afterburner for the GPU. Sorry, for GPU temperature and monitoring and boost frequency. So the way that you use Core Temp, it's really straightforward. Once you've installed it, just go to Settings. Here in Advanced, not Advanced, sorry. Where is it? Display, General, Notification Area. Highest temperature per processor, or just highest temperature, because I think by default it's on all core and that looks a bit confusing. You might have like 12 cores here, or 6 cores, but you just need the highest temperature because that's what's important. So highest temp 40, and then select your color so it's easy to read, and just have it running. Like, it uses 2 MB of your RAM and 0 of your CPU, so you can just run this 24/7, and it's a good, especially for liquid coolers. It's a good way to make sure that your CPU, nothing's failed and nothing is clogged up or filled with dust, or there's not a background app that's like, you could have a background malware that's eating up CPU cycles, and your OS feels a little bit sluggish. But the only way to know for sure is you look down at your temperature and it's running at 60 idle instead of 30 or 40. So it's a good idea to just run Core Temp, and then after a gaming session, like, you can clear the minimum and max here, reset high-low. After a gaming session, rather than alt-tabbing out and checking frequently, just play for half an hour, alt-tab out, close the game, and check your max column to make sure that nothing's overheating. And then there's another more technical ways. You run an OSD. I wouldn't recommend running an OSD all the time because it's going to affect your gaming immersion. It's more for people that do benchmarking and diagnostics. But just for the average user that's trying to make sure that their games are running okay in the first place, for self-diagnostics, I've got a guide that I can link. It's in the video description on how to set this up. But basically, a combination of Afterburner and RivaTuner that installs alongside it. You can run a display in your game that shows you all your system temperatures and your CPU usage, your frame rate, your frame time, a little graph. You can run all of that to make sure everything's running properly. So those are good monitoring tools you can use. And ideally, you can also just run it in the background. And as you can see here, there is a max temperature, and you can set which parameters you want to monitor. But there's GPU temperature. You can get your on AMD GPUs, you can get the hotspot temperature. You can see down here memory temperature. Not for all GPUs. I think it's just AMD. I don't know if NVIDIA have memory temperature on all their GPUs. Voltages, etc. VRM temperature on AMD. And you can detach this, but basically you can go through and make sure that the maxes aren't hitting some crazy high numbers, just for self-monitoring. And this is also where you'll adjust your fan profiles for the GPU. So for NVIDIA, you just create a profile there, and for AMD, you do it through the Adrenalin drivers. Don't avoid using MSI Afterburner. I'm only using MSI on AMD for monitoring. I'm not using any overclocking settings. This is Afterburner is detecting my Adrenalin settings, but it's not setting anything itself. There's no profile saved here, and there's no fan profile, because what happens is because the AMD GPUs have built-in fan control with their drivers, unlike NVIDIA, it can conflict with third-party software. So if I enable fan control here, flickering and all sorts of black screen issues, it's just, I would expect that, because there's a conflict. Because you're running two different fan controls softwares at once, because it's built in, okay? So you can see I've set a custom profile here for AMD, but if I was on NVIDIA, I would just go here and set a profile in here. And ideally, you just want your fan ramping up to around 75% under high gaming load. So high gaming load might be 60, 65 degrees. You already want to be at 70%. 70% can be a bit noisy, but it's going to stop it from overheating to the point that your GPU boost clock is dropping down. And that's what some people will say, oh, my game runs fine for 10 minutes. And then suddenly the FPS drops. That's your turbo boost dropping clocks, because your graphics card started to get hot. And generally, the stock fan profiles will they'll allow the GPU to get hot before they spin up, rather than spinning up as the GPU is warming up. It's not linear, so you're better off setting your fan speed to jump up under any sort of mid to high end load. So you could estimate you'd definitely be under a gaming load above 60 degrees on most GPUs. So if you know that that's a gaming load temperature, instead of having your fan speed start to spin up at 70 degrees, which is already starting to get hot, have it spin up at 65 degrees. And then that'll stop it from hitting 70 in the first place. Because once it hits 70, if the fan spins up after that, it'll actually be harder for that temperature to come down, because it's already at capacity, than if you just have it coming up sooner. So yeah, ideally you want your temps under 80C. This is like on stock coolers and on the included Ryzen coolers. 80C under load, and you can improve that through the BIOS that I mentioned earlier, the BIOS undervolting. You can also undervolt GPUs. Like there's an undervolt option built in if you're on automatic. You can just hit undervolt GPU with AMD, and that can give you a baseline to work off. It's not always going to give you the best settings, but you can get a rough idea of where you can start. And then if you get like crashing artifacts, you just bump up the voltages. Depending on if it's under load in game, you would bump up the voltage here. 10 at a time might be a good starting point, or you can just go 50 at a time if you don't have a long time to diagnose. And if it's a desktop, if you're getting desktop flickering or desktop issues, black screens, you might find bumping these up, because I noticed that AMD were changing these default voltages at the driver level. So from version 19 to version 2020, when I tried to go into my manual tuning, I noticed that by default these were all higher. So they've been trying to help people with stability, and that might be why some people are saying their stability is better with 20.4 compared to 20.2, because they've obviously been tuning the drivers to be more compatible across the range of instability issues that people are having. That's my son Elijah. He's just fascinated by the camera. So there's that, and you can also undervolt. It's the same thing, but with NVIDIA, you might be better off using aftermarket software. So you can see here there's core voltage control. I think you unlock these. I've upgraded to, oh, not upgraded, but I've moved over to AMD, so it's a bit more confusing, but to remember it all. But unlock voltage control here, and you can adjust these. Sometimes there's another thing you can do if you're getting high temps and your boost clock is not stable, so you get the 30-minute gameplay and then you get the performance drop. Instead of still do the fan control, do your fan profile, but instead of focusing on undervolting, you might not be able to undervolt for whatever reason, stability reasons. You might not have any room to undervolt. Try lowering the turbo boost. So if your boost clock for your specific, because all the aftermarket brands of graphics cards have different turbo boost frequencies depending on their cooler. So an MSI might have a different, the same model card might have a slightly higher turbo boost than an Asus card, or vice versa. And if you're having issues getting that turbo boost stable, so it might be advertised as 1750, but your gaming load turbo boost is 1730 for some reason. That's usually temperature related. If your temps are really good, it should reach 1750. But if for some reason it's only going 1730 and then it starts to get hot and your fan profile's not enough because you've got really high room temps, it might be a hot climate where you live, and you're finding your boost temperature, boost frequency is dropping down to like 1680, then what's up? Yeah, I know, you told me. I said I'll help you after this. I'm almost done, dude. Just go wait. Yeah, I've got to finish this video. Um, sorry about that. So what you can do to try to get your turbo to be more consistent is you can also just manually drop your peak frequency, your peak boost frequency to 1700. I'm not going to click yes in here because this is for AMD. I would do it down here. So you'd either manually set it, or like for my specific GPU, it's 1750 by Sapphire. But if I was running the stock cooler with the stock fan profile, I might find that it wasn't hitting anywhere near 1750, and the temps were actually getting too hot after a certain time, and then I was getting a fluctuating boost clock. So instead of running 1750, I might run 1700, and 1700 might never push the temp to a point where it has to downclock. It might just be stable at boost for extended periods. But usually the fan profile will get that into check. It just depends on how noisy you're willing to run your fan. So if your limit is 70%, you might not want to run 100%. You might have to play with your peak frequencies to get that to get the right balance and performance that you want. So that's that. That's your fan control and GPU out of the way. And now it comes to stress testing. Like with those applications I told you, your MSI Afterburner. You can even use GPU-Z. It's actually a decent, specifically GPU monitoring. That might be a little bit easier to understand rather than MSI Afterburner. Yeah, after buddy. Here under sensors, you can see here it's got the voltages. It's even got CPU temperature and GPU-Z now. This is another similar program like CPU-Z. It's small footprint and easy to use, and I think you can run it down in the tray. Yep. And basically, for your GPU temperature, you can just double click it max, and that will tell you the max reading that it's got over your gameplay or whatever, to make sure that it's not getting too hot at certain moments. And this can be different than just staring at an in-game temperature monitor, because the temperature monitor won't always tell you the max. Like if I load up an OSD, I won't necessarily know the max temperature it was reaching during gameplay if I just glance at the OSD every now and then, rather than having a max reading in something like this, or checking the max in Afterburner through the monitoring section here, because this doesn't show up on your OSD overlay. So you need to check there too and make sure it's not getting way too hot. So yeah, ideally you want under 70C in the best circumstances, but under 80C is okay if you've got like less adequate cooling. Or you might consider, if you're getting 90C, you definitely got to do something to fix your cooling to get your temps into check for optimal performance. Now, as far as benchmarking goes and stability testing, to make sure, because this is even for pre-built systems, you might want to make sure your system's stable, especially if you've had game crashes or low performance. After you've made sure that everything up here is in check, you can run Asus RealBench for just general system stability for your CPU and GPU and your RAM. and that'll throw up errors if it's slightly unstable, and it'll outright crash the system if there's a severe instability or temp-related issue. Just be sure to try to have some sort of temp monitor open while you're running the benchmark so that you can keep an eye on temps. Because if it gets if you have an inadequate cooling, it could get so hot as to not be good for your CPU, not be good for your hardware. So you might want to run hardware monitor or hardware info 64 for AMD systems because it's supposed to be more accurate. But I'm running a mix. I'm running AMD with a 6700K, so it's not a big deal for me. But they're very similar, hardware monitor and info 64. And ideally, you just want to close all this voltage stuff. You can see there's a misreading here. It's not 127. And basically, you want to look at your package temps here for your CPU. RAM temps to a lesser degree, not that important. It's mainly your CPU temps and your and your GPU. Oh, hardware monitor doesn't have it. So your GPU temps, you might have this open, but I don't think the SUSE RealBench will really stress your GPU too much. It's more what's it called, 3D Mark. So if you run 3D Mark, Unigen, superposition, those are benchmarks that will stress your GPU. But you want to run a combination of all these to make sure that your system is stable under all these different conditions. And you can also check your memory bandwidth, specifically in relation to your RAM speed and your dual channel RAM, to make sure that there's not an issue with your drivers or some other factor that might be limiting your memory bandwidth. Yes, buddy, I'm almost done. Almost there, almost there. So I'll just show you real quick what I mean. I won't actually run the memory bandwidth test because it'll literally hang my system. You don't want to, not hang my system, but it'll cause the recording to lag. So basically, you want to close everything that includes Google Chrome, open IDA64, go into Tools, and go into Cache and Memory Benchmark, and hit Start Benchmark. And if you've benchmarked, once you've done that, you'll get it's these top results that are in relation to your memory. And you might see benchmarks online if you Google your specific memory kit, where they've tested the kit and then it's rated for like benchmarking websites will generally use the same application. And it'll be like 40,000 Mbps read, write, copy, or some combination of that. Like it might vary a little bit, but you can get a ballpark idea of what you should be getting. And if you're down at 20,000 Mbps when you should be getting 40, then there's a definite memory issue there. It could be driver related. It could be BIOS related with the timings, with the XMP configuration. There might be an issue with that kit of RAM and your BIOS settings that is causing, like there might be a subtiming that's been set wrong by the BIOS. Like for me, TRFC is one of the subtimings. If that's set really high by your kit of RAM with your BIOS, you'll end up with really bad copy speeds or read and write speeds. So you might need to address that in stability test through a combination of these stress test programs. And then real world usage is the final thing. Like once you're fairly sure you're stable in all these, like if you're not throwing errors that like for example, if you get errors in RealBench, it might mean you need to, and you've undervolted your CPU or you've got it on auto. It could be from overheating, or you just need to bump your voltage a little bit. Depending on if your temps are good, then you might just need to bump your vCore voltage up a little bit from what you loaded to previously. And then for memory, you might need to tune the memory a bit more and look up a memory overclocking tuning guide. I might do a video on that too, but it is tedious and it's different for everyone. So it's kind of like overclocking, and that's the reason I don't specifically do overclocking guides, because you can't just copy someone else's overclock settings and expect them to work. You can use them as a guideline. If they have the same CPU, similar motherboard and everything, you can use them as a guideline, but just because one person got 3200 megahertz RAM working with their CPU at 4.6 and it's the same CPU and RAM doesn't mean you can do it, because the same CPU and RAM are not always the same quality memory controller and binning of the CPU even for overclocking. But I'll get to that in another one. You can also see here what I've written. Like you could have, maybe some people have already skimmed through all this and already left the video. That's fine. But just to be aware of these types of benchmarks so you can check your system performance. And lastly, what else? Fan profiles, I kind of skipped ahead to that. If you're getting black screen issues, this can also affect NVIDIA high-end GPUs. They can get black screen issues too. It's not just AMD. Try disabling hardware acceleration, because there were people in the NVIDIA forums, NVIDIA, that recommended disable hardware acceleration on 2080 Ti's that were getting black screens. But there's also a few other things you can check. Monitor cables, your power cables on both the GPU and the PSU side, because when you're routing cables, you can actually pull something a bit loose. Possibly remount the GPU, because there's the tab of the GPU, the metal tab, can sometimes hit the motherboard before it's meant to slot in right near the PCI slots, and the gap just before the PCI slots on the, sometimes even the outside of the case, but hopefully the inside. There's a little slot where the metal tabs of the GPU will insert into, and it's kind of just near the motherboard. So what happens is sometimes if your GPU is slightly misaligned, you could actually hit your motherboard and think that your GPU is plugged in, and the tab clicks. Like it'll click on the right side of the GPU where the PCI slot tab is, but your bracket has actually hit the motherboard, and that can happen where if you're a first-time builder, you're not even aware of that because you weren't staring at that spot. But usually, if it happens, you won't be able to screw your GPU in properly. But it's possible that someone might just force it and push their motherboard or something. Or they might be hitting the metal, but they're not in the slot properly, like the metal of the motherboard tray, and then they've just forced the screwdriver, the screw in, and their card's not actually mounted properly, inserted properly. So sometimes reinstalling the GPU can help, and also dust in the GPU slot can cause issues. Same for your RAM slots. So if you're really like at your wit's end and you've been checking everything, those are a couple extra things you can check. And lastly, if you're just gaming or using if you're getting blue screens basically, and you've gone through all the other stuff, but you're not sure what like sometimes the blue screen can be overclocking or undervolt related, but sometimes it's not. And if you want a quick and easy way to diagnose your blue screens on your own, just go to Google, type in blue screen view, and this program will basically help you to diagnose your own issues. What's the root cause of your blue screens? So once you've got that installed, so I've got this installed here. I did have a crash a while back. My last crash was because I was running, and it's funny because it happened shortly after running this software for the first time. So I knew it was the software. It was a driver level crash because of Logitech USB video class driver. That was the cause, because I wasn't running anything different other than this software, and it was open at the time. But you might get other crashes that are related to your DirectX graphics. This was with one of the new games. I think it was with Doom Eternal before they released an update to fix crashes. It was literally they had a patch that says fix some crashes. So basically, I knew what the cause was there. But if you're in doubt, you basically you look at your dump files, and this is what you need to Google, the bug check code. Instead of typing in the whole code, don't do OX00003B. You can just go bsod OX, and that's 0 like the number, 3B. System service exception. And usually you can get an idea of what causes it. Not all the time, because this is a random bsod error that I've looked up. That was actually caused by the graphics of the game, though. That's a bit more harder. You wouldn't diagnose this, you would just look here. And I'd go, okay, it was probably the game. I was playing a new game. It's just released. It's not my system's fault. I'm not going to randomly start stress testing based on this bsod. But if you're playing an older game that you know should be stable and you're getting issues, then that's when the bug check codes can really help. You just type this in for stability. Overclocking and system stability, even at stock settings, is actually related when you're trying to troubleshoot issues. So you can actually find error codes, OX124, and you can find out what you need to change in your BIOS to get stability. So as you can see, OX124 can be related to your vCore or IMC voltage. Watchdog timeout OX101, and like I said, it'll be like 10001 or something like that. But OX101, add vCore, page fault in non-paged area, RAM timings. And see, a lot of these are add vCore or add IMC voltage, driver IQ not less or equal. But it also depends on the situation. If it's a new game or a new driver that's just buggy, sometimes you can get similar codes that are actually, when you look in blue screen view, you realize that it's actually might just be a software issue. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on that, and then I'll go into more detailed guides in future ones, because this is going to go into a new playlist that I'll call Troubleshooting. So that's it, guys, and hope you learned something, and hope that helps with anyone having issues. And yeah, just comment if you want me to do something more specific, and I'll go into it, because I do have I'm 32 now, and I built my first computer at 14, so yeah, I've got a bit of experience, and I've been troubleshooting all my own issues. I never went to a computer store. I just literally researched how to fix my own issues. Okay, buddy, I'm done. Okay, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.